Everyone, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance Global Summit, a new spectrum mindset. Next slide. This is the second virtual Dynamic Spectrum Alliance Global Summit event that's been held virtually. I don't think any of us believed it would happen this way last year, and to go into a second year is quite remarkable. Yet what has made it possible, I think, is our ability to be connected and stay online on platforms like this. And wireless spectrum is the key to that. So this is a very timely and appropriate event. My name is Steve Song. I'm a policy advisor with the Mozilla Corporation, and it's my pleasure to be your MC for this event. And without further ado, then, I would like to welcome and introduce, before I go there, let me just a couple of words on logistics. So the event is being recorded for use by the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance in distribution, and the slides will be posted on the website following the event. For questions, please use the platform to ask questions or make comments, but we'll address them at the end of each speaker presentation or panel session so that we can be sure to have enough time to go over the material. And if there are points of clarification, we'll try and address those in real time. And now on to our keynote presentation from Dr. Martha Suarez, President of the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Steve, and hi everyone. It's really a pleasure to see you this year, to see you in a new edition of the DSA Global Summit. We are really excited to welcome you, to have the opportunity of having this event online, and also to see so many participants from different geographies and regions. So it's really a pleasure for us to organize this event this year. A few words. First, please follow up us on social media, and don't hesitate to contact us if there are any questions or if you would like to also have further discussions on spectrum sharing. Next slide, please. So a few words about the DSA. I think it's important to remember, to make a reminder of our mission. So the DSA is a global cross-industry non-for-profit organization, and we are convinced about the importance of spectrum sharing and dynamic spectrum access. We think that this is a great tool to increase connectivity and also to provide affordable solutions for people and objects to be all connected, and to make sure that no one is left behind. Next slide, please. So I would like to start saying again a few welcome words. I would like to recognize our sponsors for this year's event. So there are different sponsors that have been supporting us. And also, next slide, please. So I would also like to thank all the speakers that have accepted to participate and to provide their insights, their vision, and their thoughts on spectrum sharing and their broadband national plans. So a quick overview to the agenda. We are going to have 3 days of event, and one difference regarding the event we had last year is that this time we are having different time zones. So there will be one session. So this is our first session today. And then we are going to have another session in the evening for the Americas, but in the morning tomorrow for Asia Pacific. So we will have that tomorrow. In total, there will be 5 sessions. So this first one, the second one tomorrow in the morning, Asia Pacific, or this evening, America's time. Day 2, we will have the 3rd session, and then we will have on Thursday the last 2 sessions. The first one mainly with regulators, and the last one will be also including a vision from internet service providers. So next slide, please. We invite you also to be active in social media and to share your questions and comments using the DSA Global Summit hashtag in social media. So it has been a very busy year since last time we had the DSA Summit in November last year. I took, here is a map of all the filings we have been submitting as DSA in this year, so in the last 6 months. And we have seen a lot of interest on spectrum sharing, on different opportunities, on different frameworks. And we are seeing that interest growing constantly. So this is a map of those countries or administrations or regions, in many cases, for example, in Europe to the ECC, that we have sent contributions. Next slide, please. And it's also useful to see our global activity. I wanted to summarize some of the actions that have been taken, I would say, outstanding places in terms of discussions. So we have had different consultations about ICT legal frameworks. For example, there is a new ICT law that is under development in Dominican Republic. There have been also many consultations about spectrum policy and spectrum roadmaps, like the case of the European radio spectrum policy, but many more. We have seen also a lot of consultations about the future of the 6 GHz band. That is certainly a very relevant subject for many regulators and spectrum authorities all around the world. We have seen some consultations about client-to-client device communications in unlicensed mode in the 6 GHz band. We keep also having consultations about updates in the rules for unlicensed access in the 2.45 gigahertz and also in the 5.9 gigahertz band. There have been some consultations. We have also answered comments about spectrum sharing initiatives, many of them in mid-band, and many of them related also to the 5G plans. And some consultations about 60 gigahertz, consultations about the future of TV white spaces, and in many cases national nodes about unlicensed access to those bands, and also in some cases the operating rules for that technology, and other different aspects. So the reason I wanted to highlight this is because I want to insist on an important aspect, and that is spectrum sharing is it's really a set of tools and technologies that can really provide more efficient use to the spectrum, and there are many opportunities for having spectrum sharing and dynamic spectrum access. Next slide, please. Yeah, I would like also to provide a few words about Wi-Fi 6. So as you have seen, DSA has been actively advocating for more spectrum for Wi-Fi, in particular in the 6 gigahertz band. And the reason for that is because we see a lot of benefits associated to the new generation of Wi-Fi 6, which is the 6th generation of Wi-Fi. And there are many advantages, and we also are convinced about how important this technology has. It has been important since for the last 20 years, but in the recent months, it has been crucial for many people to have broadband access and to continue working and studying and just having better connectivity. Next slide, please. We have seen that unlicensed access has been going through a tremendous momentum globally. This is a very exciting map courtesy of Aruba. And we can see here that in the region of the Americas, there are already 8 countries that have decided to open the entire 6 gigahertz band for unlicensed access. We also have seen countries and administrations in Region 2 and in region, not only in Region 2, but also in Region 1 and Region 3 that have, they went through the process and they decided to also open access to the band. And we also have some administrations, like the case of Europe, that have decided to open the lower part of the band, 500 megahertz, and also other countries like Morocco, that was one of the last announcements we had. But it's really a great momentum. It's like we are having consultations every week. We are having new announcements every month, and I think that is a clear proof of how important this discussion is. We have more than 40 countries now that have decided to enable unlicensed access to the band, and those are great news, because it means that we have economies of scale and possibilities of having also good opportunities in terms of ecosystem and service. Next slide, please. And we have heard different arguments every time we are discussing with regulators in regions and countries. We are facing and understanding their challenges. So I wanted to highlight some of those important aspects. Like one, unlicensed access to the 6 GHz band is providing also protection from harmful interference to the incumbents. So it's really a very efficient use of the spectrum. We are also enabling conditions for new use cases like augmented reality, virtual reality, with enough channels that have enough bandwidth. So in this case, we can have channels of up to 160 megahertz. And we are also seeing a lot of advance in terms of Wi-Fi 7. That will be one of the main advantages of Wi-Fi 7 is that you will have channels of 320 megahertz bandwidth. Other important aspect is that Wi-Fi and unlicensed access is not only for developed economies where we are having excellent fiber penetration, but it's also important for countries that are still trying to close the gap and are still trying to provide broadband access to all the citizens, because they rely in many cases on Wi-Fi hotspots, on public access through the municipalities. So I would say my final comment here is that the ecosystem for Wi-Fi 6 is available, it's ready, and we will hear more later in the session, in the second part of this first session today, and it's available now. So I think that is one of the main trade-offs for regulators, is making sure that they make the most efficient use of the spectrum when it is needed. I would like to summarize there. Next slide, please. We have also seen a lot of exciting progress in mid-band discussions. Next one, please. We have already completed more than 1 year with full commercial deployments. I think it will be very soon 1.5 years of full commercial deployments of CBRS networks. So we are going to hear during the summit from different stakeholders, industry and government, about deployments of CBRS, many of the use cases that have been enabled. This is a wide ecosystem. This is really proving how we can, how spectrum sharing and dynamic spectrum access creates a lot of opportunities for all those that are involved. Access to 3GPP networks is very relevant for many. It includes verticals, it includes wireless internet service providers. There are many new business cases through neutral hosts. And we are really seeing a great momentum here. We will hear tomorrow, we will have in the morning session in the Americas time, we will have a great discussion on that. Next slide, please. And the numbers are proving how fast this is growing too. We have already many different indicators of success that we will go deeply into them in our discussion during the DSA summit tomorrow. Next slide, please. And challenges are not, I mean, you can have we have the successful story here, but there are so many new opportunities. This CBRS framework in the US has been a clear proof of having spectrum sharing, but now we also know that other administrations are interested in having similar opportunities for those stakeholders that I just mentioned, for fixed wireless access, for mobile access, not only for MNOs, but also for other interested parties like verticals, like internet service providers. And we think that there are many opportunities that should be considered case by case on the local context, but also taking into account the importance of global economies of scale, or at least large economies of scale. So in terms of opportunities, DSA has been also working with many administrations on a spectrum sharing framework and considering the solutions that could could be provided by automated frequency coordination or similar systems to the SAS that we had in the case of CBRS. Next slide, please. And yeah, still, I mean, we are seeing from one side the excitement of new technologies, like I just mentioned, Wi-Fi 6E, Wi-Fi 7, CBRS, and 5G deployments. But also, we have to recognize that there are still many challenges in terms of coverage, and that still many are still underserved or unserved completely. So DSA also continues working on TV white spaces as a great technology to provide affordable access, especially in those hard to reach areas. And we have seen also great progress recently with the announcement from Kenya about the new TV white spaces regulations. We will hear more from the Communications Authority Kenya, and also with other countries that are working on frameworks to be implemented. And also we are seeing great progress in specific projects after regulations are in place. It creates a wonderful ecosystem for new developments. Next slide, please. And I would say that in general, TV white spaces, but other technologies are a great part of a toolbox that could be implemented by regulators. So some releases this year, we had in the last, since November last year, we have been publishing some studies. We had some economic and technical studies, mainly for LATAM. We had studies assessing the economic value of unlicensed access to the 6 GHz band. And in the case of Mexico, we also conducted some studies for interference, basically for coexistence in the 6 GHz band. Next slide, please. And one of our most important studies in the last few months is going to be presented just after this session. I mean, in the, sorry, just after the break. We are going to hear about state of Wi-Fi. This is an important report that was produced for North America and Europe, and it's going to present the situation of Wi-Fi networks in those regions. So we will have John Sophie from Asia explaining more and providing more details, but we think it's an important input for regulators to understand the trends of Wi-Fi and how the traffic has been increasing in the last few months. Next slide, please. And I would say, like, a final message for all of you that have been working with us. First, thank you very much for trusting us. And second, we are still interested on working on strategic collaborations for digital inclusion and flexible frameworks. We are excited to see new collaborations, new partnerships. We have been working with universities, with multi-stakeholders organizations, and we really want to keep that momentum, and we look forward to continuing working with you, with regulators, with industry, with civil society, academic institutions, and continuing seeing this, this important momentum for spectrum sharing worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martha. That is a lot to look forward to over the next couple of days. I think, you know, if there's one thing that really stands out for me in those slides was the map showing the number of DSA submissions around the world. It's truly impressive for an organization the size of DSA in terms of the countries in which they're involved. Now, our next keynote presentation scarcely needs an introduction. He's a veteran of over 30 years at the ITU, the director of ITU Radiocommunication Bureau, Maniewicz. Welcome.
Thank you, Steve. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. I would like to start by thanking DSA and Martha in particular for the invitation and the kind introduction. As it was mentioned, I'm the director of the Radiocommunication Bureau of the ITU. I always enjoy being with you every year in the DSA Summit. And what I will do is to share with you a few slides on our perspective on spectrum management. So if we go to the next slide, please. I'm sure you are familiar with the famous quote from John Fitzgerald Kennedy that he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." At that time, it was an appeal for the people from the US to do what is right for a greater good. I would say that a similar quote applies nowadays to spectrum management. Ask not what spectrum can do for us, but what we can do for spectrum, as well as for satellite orbits, of course. So let's see what I mean by that in the next slides. So next one, please. So throughout the years, we have witnessed how the allocation of spectrum to radio communication services has enabled the delivery of more content and new applications, as well as the development of new technologies and services. It has become clear that using larger spectrum blocks has the potential to provide for increased capacities, more speed, and more coverage. Using more spectrum can also provide for increased reliability by using redundant channels. Latency would also be improved as larger bandwidth can reduce congestions in the buffers and therefore reduce latency. We can also argue that we would have lower network deployment costs, as with bigger channels, we can build less dense networks. I'm sure you have often heard about the advantages of allocating additional spectrum to a service, whether to connect more people and more devices or to reduce the cost of network deployments. All these are valid arguments. But in the next slide, what I want to focus here, however, is not on what spectrum can do for us, which is what I just mentioned in a nutshell, but what we can do for spectrum and orbits. And by we, I mean the ITU, the private sector, the manufacturers, and the service providers, as well as the public sector, the national regulators and policymakers. All actors have a role to play here. Next. If we start from the preamble of the radio regulations, it tells us very clearly that radio frequencies and associated orbits are limited natural resources, and that as such, they should be used rationally, efficiently, and economically, while in conformity with the provisions of the radio regulations. This is a basic principle that is there, it's been there forever, and we tend to forget it. And I think this is the ABC of spectrum management, and we should go back to these roots. Next. It also states that member states should endeavor to use the minimum of these resources in order to provide the services in a satisfactory manner. And to do so, they shall apply the latest available technical advances as soon as possible. Latest technical advances are supposed to be more spectrum efficiency, to bring more spectrum efficiency. So that's why it is important to use them as soon as possible. So these two principles provided by the radio regulations guide the work of ITUR, I mean the radio communication sector of the ITU that I lead, and also that of our members. So let's look into the contribution of each stakeholder in applying these provisions. Next. The telecommunications industry has implemented along the years technical advancements that have gradually improved spectrum efficiency. For example, 5G has implemented massive MIMO and beamforming features that focus the radiation on the direction of the user and enables simultaneous transmissions while keeping interference low. Similarly, Wi-Fi 6 has implemented multi-user MIMO that improves the performance of the wireless networks. In addition, higher order modulation and coding schemes implemented in both 5G and Wi-Fi 6 allow more data to be encoded in the same amount of spectrum. These are just a couple of examples of technological advancements implemented by the broadband industry that have a significant impact on spectrum efficiency. Next. Regarding the public sector that I mentioned, regulators and policymakers decide on the regulatory and licensing models that best serve their constituents and that put the spectrum to a rational, efficient, and economic use, as we said before. The adoption of a licensed or unlicensed model weighs on the need for quality, reliability, and security versus the benefits of scalability and cost. Furthermore, the adoption of a licensed model entails yet the decision of the kind of license, whether national or localized or shared or private. In some cases, several models have been implemented in the same band in a tiered approach. It is important to keep in mind that implementation of each model might require the deployment of more or less spectrum management resources, according to the burden it poses on the regulator. The best licensing model will differ from one frequency band to another one, and from one country to another, and the choice will take into account both the current services and the demands of new services. Next. On an international perspective, several technologies for spectrum sharing that will be discussed during this event are applicable to the frequency bands under study for WRC 23. So let me comment briefly on those agenda items. Let's start by agenda item 1.2, which will address the identification of several mid-bands for IMT, amongst which is the consideration of the upper part of the 6 GHz band for region 1 and 100 MHz of the 7 GHz band globally. These bands, or parts thereof, are currently allocated on a primary basis to mobile, fixed, and fixed satellite services globally. Some countries are considering the use of parts of the 6 GHz spectrum for IMT, while others are considering its use for Wi-Fi 6. Regarding agenda item 1.3, it will consider a primary allocation on the 3.6 to 3.8 GHz band to mobile services in region 1. In this band, there are many different licensing models being adopted around the world. Let me give you a couple of examples. One country already licensed the 3.7 to 3.8 GHz band for localized private networks in response to the demand of industrial sectors. This solution was adequate for them, but in countries where the industry and verticals are not inclined in acquiring and managing spectrum resources, it might leave spectrum unused. Another example is a three-tier approach adopted by another administration in the 3.55 to 3.7 GHz band. This approach enables incumbent users, priority users, and opportunistic users to share spectrum. In other countries, however, a simpler approach might be sufficient to address incumbent and new entrants. And finally, the agenda item 1.6 will review the spectrum use and spectrum needs of existing services in the UHF band in region 1, with a mobile service looking into using more of the spectrum that is currently used by broadcasting services. Let me just reiterate that some of the agenda items that I refer to, they refer only to region 1. But of course, the decision of 121 countries can certainly have an impact on all 193 countries of the world. Next. As you can see, the radio regulations and the principle that it establishes guides the work of the ITUR and that of its members. And all of us have a role to play to ensure spectrum is used as rationally, efficiently, and economically as possible. I would like to conclude by saying that in the ITU, we believe in a shared journey so that all may benefit from global regulations and standards. I talked to you about the radio regulation as the basic instrument for all these spectrum management issues. And the work that we carried out in order to update these radio regulations every 4 years is carried out in a joint approach with all members of the industry, the equipment providers, the public sector, and private sector, even the academia. So that's what I call a shared journey. Everybody, all the stakeholders have a contribution to make. And I appeal to you once again, as I do every year, to join us and contribute with your ideas and your initiatives to our work for the benefit of the whole humanity. So last slide is just a thank you note for your attention. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mario. A quick comment from Martha, I believe.
Yes, thank you very much, Steve. And I wanted to thank you, Mario. You have been very kind accepting to speak at the DSA Summit, not only this year, but since many years now. And we really appreciate to have the ITU vision here. All our members appreciate your guidance, your thoughts, and I think it's important for regulators to see how ITU is working worldwide, making sure that that we make an efficient use of the spectrum. Sounds repetitive, but that's it. And that we create the right conditions for new technologies and evolution that will benefit everyone. So personally, and on behalf of our members, I would like to thank you for accepting our invite and providing this keynote today.
Thank you, Martha. I'm the one thanking you for the invitation. I think it's important to go back to basics. I think that spectrum efficiency is something we all share, regardless of the views that we have in terms of priorities and in terms of how to better distribute it. And I think that if we go back to this basic view, we will find much more solutions available to all of us. So that's why I chose that topic to talk. I'm glad you liked it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's a great message. As the pace of technological change accelerates and demand for broadband continues to increase, the job of the ITU becomes ever more critical. And with that, I would like to turn to our next keynote speaker. He is the chairman of the National Telecommunications Agency in Brazil, ANATEL. Welcome, Leonardo Yolo de Marais. Bem-vindo.
Many thanks, Steve. Good morning, good afternoon, and also good evening to everyone that is with us. First of all, I'm very pleased to be part of this debate. A special thanks to Mrs. Marta Suarez and to Dynamic Spectrum Alliance board for the invitation. My compliments to my colleagues panelists, Maniewicz. Always good to see you. Hopefully next time in person. My compliments also to Mr. Thomas Ewers. Well, it's a pleasure to be part of this summit, considering that meetings like these are extremely helpful to tackle challenges associated to the improvement of the regulatory framework to the pace on the ongoing digital transformation. And when it comes about universal and affordable connectivity, there were a time when we only were concerned with voice, a word I would say before broadband. And in that context, universalization usually have been associated with coverage. But in a data-driven approach, it also has to do with capacity, not only with coverage. So the challenges are many, in some aspects much more complex, and that's why this debate is so relevant. And that for sure includes spectrum allocation efficiency, an increasingly critical aspect of our task as regulators, right? Then it comes, it's important to take into account if you really want to make the most of the digital opportunities. Having said that, let me share quickly some aspects of the regulatory agenda that we have been pursuing in Brazil. Next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of ANATEL powers and duties, by law, we are responsible and accountable for promoting the expansion of access and usage of services with adequate quality and prices, stimulating competition and sector sustainability, promoting dissemination of sector data and information, promoting consumer satisfaction, organizing and regulate the operation of telecom services in Brazil, issuing grants, and monitoring compliance with rules and apply sanctions, managing the spectrum of radio frequencies and satellite orbits, and certifying telecommunications products, representing also Brazil in the international telecommunications forums as ITU, and among others. So next slide, please. Thank you. In order to comply with such commitments and duties, it is important to understand the telecom infrastructure gaps. Of course, we are continuously improve the work of identifying telecommunications infrastructure gaps in Brazil. Nevertheless, currently, we understand that fulfilling many of the gaps starts with improving the backhaul infrastructure. High capacity data transport infrastructure is crucial to successfully achieve goals related to universal connectivity. Regardless of the access technology and architecture, it will be necessary to offload the traffic. And as the slide shows, 82% of the municipalities representing more than 93% of the population is served with optical fiber. And therefore, 18%, approximately 1,000 cities, do not have this infrastructure backhaul with fiber. And such cities are mostly in the north and northeast of Brazil. So backhaul gaps in Brazil still is an important issue to be properly addressed. But in terms of access infrastructure, 4G is the best technology available in 93% of the municipalities. Fiber is the most used category of access in terms of fixed broadband. And fixed broadband density is something about 50% of households. So one of our main challenges is to provide to about 10,000 no main districts access to 4G LTE coverage. By no main districts, I mean villages, many with a population of only 600 to 1,000 residents. The next slide, please. Thank you. So I think Brazil has not done bad in terms of assigning spectrum to IMT. All the way around, Brazil has assigned a significant amount of spectrum to IMT. Nevertheless, as many of you are aware, we are working hard on the next auction process. This auction shall be very significant in terms of the total amount of spectrum that we will provide to the market. And why this is important? Because capacity, or spectrum capacity, better saying, is in simple terms the product of three factors: the amount of cells, spectrum efficiency, and the amount of spectrum available. So we shall auction a leftover of 10 plus 10 megahertz in the band of 700 megahertz. Also 90 megahertz regarding the band of 2.3 gigahertz. Then we shall auction up to 400 megahertz in the band of 3.5 gigahertz, which is the main gateway to the 5G technology, considering the ecosystem of equipment already available on the market. And at last but not least, better saying, we also auction 3.2 gigahertz in the millimeter band of 26 gigahertz, which nowadays have been used to provide, for example, fixed wireless access, which allows transmission rates similar to those currently traded through fiber. And ANATEL has made also efforts, as the slide shows, to contribute to create a regulatory environment favorable to the development and implementation of private telecommunications networks, and notably those used in applications of logistic control, sensing, monitoring, automation, and other needs of the so-called 4.0 industry. And next slide, please. If you keep just pressing, I think there's animation, just go to the end, please. Yes. Perfect. Thank you. I think it's important to highlight that we are working on an auction format that has a bias towards more investment commitments instead of an approach that privileges a money-raising process. This is due to the perception that the auction is a great opportunity to implement public policies in order to expand access and the telecommunications infrastructure. So in other words, we intend to make the auction an effective tool to address the infrastructure gaps that I have mentioned earlier. So the pricing process for granting the right of spectrum usage is based on a complex and hypothetical business model plan. There are many variables and assumptions for premises that impact the net present value. And as I mentioned, we design an auction format that does not have a mere fundraising purpose. Quite the opposite, more than 9% of the opportunity cost of the bands, that is the economic value of the right of usage, will be charged in the form of investments. And besides, these auctions have been also an important tool to foster competition by using spectrum caps also. And the outcome in Brazil is clear. In terms of HHI, Brazil has one of the lowest Refindauchrichtungen index of the world, which for sure reflects better prices, conditions, and rivalry between mobile operators. And next slide, please. Thank you. So updating the spectrum use regulation is a priority on ANATEL's regulatory agenda. And this update will include the implementation of two innovations that resulted from the revision of the General Law of Telecommunications, notably the possibility of successive spectrum renewal and spectrum trading. These two aspects were not possible according to the previous legal framework. And additionally to the secondary market rules details, other aspects will be improved. For instance, the conditions related to coordination process and spectrum sharing. And regarding the coordination process, we are implementing computational systems to address the challenges associated. Hopefully, they shall be also useful to meet requirements related to dynamic spectrum access. But in any case, I think a third-party entity will be necessary to assist us in this task. Regarding the spectrum sharing, we shall update the rules so we may facilitate and approve faster arrangements and agreements related to RAN sharing, for example. So as the slide presents, some aspects are before put a radio communications station into operation, some cases may demand prior coordination. And these will also represent opportunities for the secondary users in auction bands once we shall privilege the principal use it or share it. And according to the proposal that's currently discussed by the technical staff, in case the primary user do not reply to the potential secondary user, and if there is no obligation ruled in terms of coverage, for instance, associated with the auction process, then ANATEL may grant a 5-year license on a secondary basis. So the next slide, please. So about the wireless access system, as you all know, the last important decision was taken in 2004 after the WRC 2003 regarding the band of 5 gigahertz. Since then, last February, as many of you are aware of, and Marta showed it in her presentation, after a transparent, extensive, productive, and auspicious debate, we decided in favor of the Wi-Fi 6E in the 6 gigahertz band. And the full 1.2 gigahertz of 6 gigahertz spectrum was made available for low power indoor Wi-Fi and very low power Wi-Fi operation for portable devices. Taking this decision allows the use of this band from its initial cycle, and thus the maximization of economic and social benefits thereafter. Brazil is the very first country to adopt both very low power and low power indoor across the band, by the way. With 160 megahertz channels, it will be possible to deliver more than 2 gigabits of data, 2 gigabits per second of data to mobile devices, and 4 times typical the current Wi-Fi speeds. Moreover, this decision paves the way for the future implementation of Wi-Fi 7 and NRU technologies in Brazil, a new radio license. Right now, we are following foreign countries' decisions on stand power, and we expect to include this scenario in our regulation in the future. And to finish this slide, ANATEL's board also requested that the technical division further evaluate if there is a need to update Wi-Fi 6 out-of-band emissions limits to guarantee coexistence with intelligence transport systems in 5.9 gigahertz, considering also regional harmonization. We expected to receive this report in a couple months. And later today, I guess, in session 2, our head manager of Spectrum Administration, Mr. Agostinho Linhares, will present a keynote regarding this topic. And among other things, he can share more information on the process, which is being conducted by his team. Next slide, please. About white space devices, the final terms of the proposed resolution are under the report of Commissioner Emmanuel. We already discussed that in public consultas. And as you know better than me, one of the important issues is related to the use of geolocation database methods in order to identify the available radio frequencies blocks in a given locality. The idea is that ANATEL will set the specifications and enable providers like third-party entities to be responsible for the development and management of the databases. We think some flexibility and quickness shall be necessary, and for that reason, technical and operation requirements will be established by means of infra-regulatory standard and should pose, for example, power limits, specific technical requirements of the geolocation database, spurious out-of-band emissions limits, and other conditions to protect broadcasting service, as this slide shows. Well, I guess I don't have enough time to detail other subjects like HAPS, like 6 gigahertz, but the main message, I guess, is that we are modernizing the regulation related to spectrum management so that it is flexible and allows for the reception and implementation of different business models. And next slide, please. So to finally conclude, I'd like to reinforce that spectrum allocation is an element that can leverage telecommunications infrastructure, and spectrum efficiency allocation, I think, is one of the main pillars to make us succeed and to foster the process of digital transformation that will lead our society to the next level of social and economic development. And we need to be creative and wise when balancing the spectrum policy, tackling accordingly a trade-off between spectrum efficiency and competition, so we can get the best outcomes and from our regulatory decisions. And by doing so, I am also confident that we shall not only contribute to the digital connectivity, but we will foster it. Further than that, I think we will give also a contribution to many of the sustainable development goals that ITU always states and reinforce the importance. So there is a topic in this final slide that we are changing our regulation in terms of approach that requires a search for solutions that maximize the intersection of public and private interest. So we have changing only fines and penalties that normally go to the courts, to obligations to do, and try with these instruments also to breach the digital gaps in Brazil. But with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and again, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Leonardo. We have a quick question from the audience, and it is regarding the implementation of the geolocation database. Do you have a sense of when the specification will be published?
Thank you, Steve. I don't have still a timeline to give you right now, but we are doing on home some specifications, as I said, some computation systems we have been developing, but we also have an agreement with ITU that will help us out in this text. I think the second semester of this year we will have good news for you.
Right. Thank you. And one more question, if I may, from the audience, and it's regarding the reserve prices for the spectrum auction. Does the chairman expect very low reserve prices for the future auction?
What I expect as in terms of megahertz, the cost of the megahertz PPP, I think it's going to be one of the lowest, much lower than the median the average that we have been seeing. But more important than that, as I mentioned in the presentation, is that we are looking for an approach that privileges investment commitment. So what I mean is that let's suppose that the reserve price is 100. So more than 90 of this 100 will be demanded as investment commitments. In terms of money, less than 10 will be demanded from the market. So that's what I mean, not having only a fundraising approach. And I think this is important because in many areas, there is no economic attractiveness to the market to deploy network. So the auction is a tool to boost infrastructure in these localities.
Thank you again, Leonardo. It's truly inspiring to hear the range of activities that Brazil is undertaking to make spectrum available, across the entire country. Thank you. And now I think if we don't have any other questions, we will move on to our last keynote speaker. And I'd like to introduce Thomas Ewers, Head of Section for International Spectrum Affairs for the Bundesnetzagentur, BNetzA. Welcome, Thomas.
Yes, thank you very much, Steve. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this very important global summit, and also best regards to my dear panelist members. And I think if we should start directly with the presentation, I think that would be the best way ahead. By the way, can you hear me?
Yes. Loud and clear.
I do believe I have some audio problems, but we will see. Then I think coming to the issue, so dynamic spectrum access, where do we go? And if you go directly to the next slide, through history, we have seen that shared use is a common thing, basically. And what I did here, I copied a definition coming from the European Electronic Communications Code about the definition of shared use. And of course, this definition covers basically intra-service and inter-service multi-tiered approaches. But I would like to indicate that, of course, there can be a mixture of individual rights, general authorization combinations, and there is still the need to define the relative sharing arrangements. And we are certainly working based on these definitions in the European theatre. And next slide, please. Thank you. So what type of different measures do we have on the table? Stemming from, let's say, individual licensing, also we had available in the past general authorizations. And then when we look to the timeline, more efficient technologies and mitigation techniques to avoid interference were shown on the market and were developed based on the availability of technologies in this regard. And I'm pretty sure that what you can see on the slide is certainly not a comprehensive list, but it will be continued. So there will be additional opportunities in the future to have advanced sharing and also to share bands by different applications, which might be not possible at this stage. And if you go to the next slide, then you can see what we have on the table and the reasons. The reason is basically that everybody has an interest in further sharing spectrum bands to have faster access to bands already used by others, and also to serve the not yet served, and also to get additional opportunities to serve the public with innovative services. And of course, looking to the history, all demands and increasing applications, and my previous fellow speakers already indicated the ever increasing demand of applications for more broadband, for cost-efficient implementations, and the need to avoid harmful interference. And also one additional element is to ease administrative burden. And by saying administrative burden, I mean for both sides, so the administrators and the applicants. And what we have seen in the past is basically that there were tailored specific demands and to incumbent services to deal with very specific issues. I remember very well when we approved the first ECC decision in the European theatre on the 5 GHz wireless LAN band in 1999. There, this dynamic frequency selection was invented, and over the timelines, there was always a demand for balancing demand and the implementation costs, which basically means that each and every solution has to be tailored to what is on the table. And in this regard, at least my belief is that dynamic spectrum access is not a goal by its own, but it's a mean. And it's a mean to get access to bands for applications which were not possible in the past. And if you go to the next slide, there's certainly the issue about complexity of the system. We started with listen before talk, and then going to CBRS and ELSA, LSA. But if you click once, I think we need to keep in mind that the system applied in the specific bands certainly needs to be proportionate. I give you one example that is a European regulation in the electronic communications code. You will see that the license exempt regulation is the default. So in this regard, if you move away from license exempt to individual licensing or to even more complicated systems, there always needs to be a justification for that. And then when we see what additional opportunities dynamic spectrum access systems provide, it's mainly related also to the changing environment in the band under investigation. So if you have a very slow moving environment, then I do believe that the implementation cost of a very complex dynamic spectrum access systems is difficult to justify. But the more movement and the more flexible and the more time shift you have in the usage pattern of a certain band with highly flexible and changing spectrum use, then the complexity of the needed system is certainly increased. And we always have to balance between what is the demand from the applicant or the demand from the new entrant or the demand from the new application, and mirror that to the complexity of the sharing environment, which has to be defined still, even in the presence of dynamic spectrum access. Then, of course, there needs to be tailored solutions. So what do we need, if you go to the next slide, to find these solutions which are then applicable to everybody in a certain band to provide additional sharing. And I believe the overarching principle is confidence. And in this regard, the sharing system needs to be trusted by the incumbents and the entrants. And of course, we have to provide investment security and stability. And this is not only related to the regulatory systems in terms of licensing, but it's also related to market surveillance and monitoring, and even down to the level of specifications and standards regarding the trust of the people, regarding conformity of the systems to these standards. And of course, in the RSPG opinion, which I refer to later on a little bit on additional sharing, then also the element of receiver quality and down to the last bit of the technologies available plays a vital role in regarding this. And what do we need? So do we need open structures? So if you take into account that if we talk about dynamic access systems, which are beyond the automation of licensing regime on an administrative level, meaning systems where the applicant still has to type in where, when, and which band from time A to time B he would like to use. In this regard, certainly data exchange format don't play a vital role. But if you go a step beyond that, for automated systems where basically the dynamic access system coordinates through direct connections to the device, to the base stations, to other types of applications in a multi-tiered coordination approach, then of course there needs to be food for thought regarding harmonized data exchange format, and to guarantee that really everybody has a possibility that the device is connected to the system. And this provides more complexity. And I believe there needs to be an open discussion on that regarding these formats, to have some kind of a technology neutrality also for access to those bands, which are maybe in the future covered by very dynamic access systems connected with databases, automatic coordination, with an on-time reaction to the changing environment of spectrum use by primary users regarding the implementation possibility. Next slide. So what is going on? The Radio Spectrum Policy Group finished public consultation on 3 main opinions, which is one to be mentioned on the Radio Spectrum Policy Program. The opinion covers fundamental elements regarding sharing possibilities, regarding new bands for broadband applications, regarding governance, and a list of other things. And it's very easy to access those draft opinions. If you just search in the internet for RSPG, at least in my browser, is the first hit on the top, where you can download all these documentations. And it is also important to mention that on the opinion on spectrum sharing, of course, the exchange of best practice, I think, is one key element to make this overall structure a success. That we have an exchange of views, like at this event here, exchange of experience with dynamic access systems, what can be applied in which band, also tailored to maybe some national specific circumstances, but to have an ongoing discussion regarding these best practices, I think that's one key element. And one additional RSPG opinion which has been consulted is on additional spectrum needs and guidance for the fast rollout of future wireless broadband services, which is also in the direction of IMT. You might be aware that also as an outcome of WRC 19 in the European theater, we are underway of developing the access conditions for IMT applications in the 42 gigahertz band. And this is an activity which is still going on. And all these opinions are supposed to be finally approved at the next meeting of the RSPG, which is foreseen, or which is scheduled for the 16th June 2021. So more on the concrete, if you go to the next slide. Thank you. More on the concrete. The new spectrum for radio LAN in the 6 GHz band, which is namely 5945 to 6425 MHz, the regulatory framework in Europe is ready. So, which means the ECC decision is approved and published, and the EU implementing decision, which will be binding for all the member states, will be published soon. It's underway in due course. And this means that the available spectrum for Wi-Fi will almost double in Europe, because at this stage we have the 2.4 GHz band as well as the 5 GHz band. As I said, firstly harmonized in 1991 and available since quite a while. But now we have doubled the spectrum in Europe. And one important element in this regard, I believe, is that we have found a solution which is straightforward. And in all of the band, you have equal regulatory conditions in the whole band, also caring for indoor and outdoor applications in cars, trains, and aircrafts. And if you compare the situation, for example, with the 5 gigs, where you have in different parts of the band, for good reasons, different regulatory conditions, we have here in this case a straightforward and equal regulation across the whole band for low power indoor and very low power indoor and outdoor devices. And of course, each European regulation needs implementation on a national level. And in Germany, we foresee to implement the decision by a license exempt regulation at the latest in the Q3 of 2021. And I should also mention that as an outcome of the WRC 19, we also modify in Europe the 5 GHz radio LAN CEPT regulation to care for additional possibilities in vehicles, for example, and some other additional opportunities for non-fixed outdoor installations. Having said this, basically that means that within CEPT, the work on radio LANs is almost finished. As I said, the decision on 6 GHz is approved, and the final decision on the 5 GHz radio LAN modification will be hopefully approved in July 2021 at the relevant ECC meeting. Next slide. That basically means I hope I gave you a slight oversight. If you give me a final minute, I would like to indicate that also regarding the German regulation, for example, in the 26 GHz band, we started the application procedure in January this year, and we decided not to go for an auction, so everybody can apply for local licensing, and the procedure is open, and we are very keen on seeing regarding the implementation in this band as well. With this, I would like to stop for this, not saying additionally thank you for the possibility to speak at this global summit, to give maybe some food for thought on what is needed on dynamic access systems, and also some proportionality thoughts regarding the implementation possibility. And thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Can I ask all of our keynote speakers to join us, to turn their webcams on, and perhaps we can turn off the slides and take some questions from the audience, or even comments and questions among the keynote speakers. There is one question for you, Leonardo, which is from Andrew Gowans. And that was a question on the slide you had on white space technology, that there were a few different bands, it seemed, that you were planning to use white space technology for. And the question was, how are you finding equipment availability in these bands?
I'm not sure if I got all the inputs. The connection was a little bit unstable, but for what I understood about white space devices, we have still talking with the sector in terms of specifications about power conditions, about power limits, still some things about spirals, out of band emissions limit, and other conditions. Most of the bands is UHF. Some of the bands we could develop in very high frequency, VHF, but mostly will be UHF.
Thank you very much. I have my own question, if I may, regarding your spectrum sharing framework. It is very encouraging to see a use it or share it framework as part of your plans. And I'm curious to understand how the secondary 5-year license process is intended to work. Is this something that someone who is applying for one of those licenses must approach the primary spectrum holder first, and if a deal is not struck, then they must come to ANATEL as a resort, or can they apply to ANATEL directly?
Good question. As I mentioned, I'm not sure if I could explain myself very well, but as I mentioned, the current proposal is being discussed in the technical staff and is going to be presented to the board soon. But what the technical staff is thinking about, if in the case of the primary user do not reply the ask of the potential secondary user, and in case there is no obligation derived from the auction process, then ANATEL may grant to the secondary user a 5-year license on a secondary basis. So in that area, it's a polygonal, define it, you would have access for 5 years in the secondary basis if the primary users do not reply his solicitude.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Martha, I don't know if you have any comments or reflections on the keynote presentations.
Thank you, Steve. I really like this presentation from all the speakers from the keynotes, very appropriate. And this idea to just ask Leonardo about, Chairman Euler, about the use it or share it framework is very interesting. I wonder if we can take a few minutes also to ask Thomas about the spectrum sharing conditions for the 6 gigahertz band. You mentioned that they would be exclusively indoors, but I wonder if you could also provide a few more details, because Germany has been also taking leadership in dedicated spectrum for industry. So I would like to know a little bit more on that.
Yes, thank you very much, Martha. I have to say, I noted in your agenda that you will have a specific also panel, I believe, early in the morning, at least for Germans, where my dear fellow Alexander Kühn will be present. So I had a small negotiation with him who presents which details, and therefore I abstained a little bit to put too much details into this. But in the ECC regulation, you will have these low power applications, which is basically indoor, including some possibilities for trains and airplanes. And this is, if I remember correctly, 200 milliwatt. And then there will be the very low power regulation for the different device type with, I think, 25 milliwatts. And this is then for indoor and outdoor. So saying that, of course, I'm aware there had also been discussions in the development of this ECC frame, basically on the use of databases to protect incumbent services. But luckily, we managed to avoid that, basically, because, as I said, my firm belief is that we have to tailor the solution to the demand. And all additional burden in terms of sharing obligations or additional burdens on mitigation implementation, like dynamic frequency selection, like listen before talk, all that basically has a cost for the new entrant. And then I think it was a good decision in Europe that now we have this regulation on the table, which can be license exempt without the additional need to have a database or to notify the stations or whatever. So straightforward, it will be license exempt. And as I said, we will implement the regulation in Germany in the third quarter.
Thank you, Thomas. We have quite a detailed question for you from H. Luana, the former president of the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance. And he says that, to me, dynamic spectrum access is all about optimizing and enabling access to underutilized spectrum with these three core trends: utilization from exclusive to shared, temporal and spatial. Second, regulation from licensed to unlicensed, as Brazil's 6 gigahertz decision. And third, allocation from static to dynamic. He wants to know, do you agree with those three core trends?
Basically, as I said already, when we look to history, I believe somebody mentioned, or I believe it was Mario, he said, go back to the basics. So the basics basically is you have different possibility to share a band. So, and the possibilities are threefold. You can share on a geographic basis, on a time basis, or you can share in terms of spectrum. And then if you have a demand on the table, like the Wi-Fi and 6 gigahertz, for example, or in other cases where you have a rapid changing environment, then of course the question on the table is, what type of access system do you need to make it possible? Because that's the overarching goal. I don't believe that any regulator would like to be in a situation that we have to say to a new entrant, sharing is not feasible. And then depending on the band under consideration, the possibilities for sharing are still the same: time, geographic, and spectrum. And then we will have to see what type of system has to be applied to make a new entrant possible, and of course to make the solution tailored to what is the demand of the entrant, because it doesn't mean anything if we have a wonderful solution but nobody can use it at the end. Regarding use it or share it, or use it or lose it, if you follow a little bit our national regulation, you mentioned also our decision on 3.7 to 3.8 to give it to private networks, to local networks. When you look very detailed in our presidential chamber decision, you will find also that there is some flexibility in it. That if the spectrum, if the upper 100 megahertz is not used on a local basis, basically for industry 4.0 or for local licensing, then there is a possibility for a time-limited approach that mobile network operators can use it. And this principle applies vice versa. That was also our motivation in the 26 gigahertz band. Of course, we had considerations, do we do an award procedure, whatever it could mean, beauty contest, auction, whatever. But our belief was that we opened the band in total. So 24.25 up to 27.5. The whole band is open for entrants and applicants who can apply at the Federal Network Agency for a license. And because of the fact that we opened the whole band, we believe there's space for everybody. And I'm not going into the detailed regulation because there are certainly some prerequisites. So if you have, let's say, applicants which are nearby each other, then of course there is a negotiation frame to care for that everybody at the end can do what he wants. Maybe with some drawbacks because they have to negotiate how to realize it, but also this possibility is implemented in the regulation.
Thank you. We have another question for you, Thomas, and that's regarding the 6425 to 7125 megahertz spectrum, and it's whether the CEPT is doing any work in that spectrum, and if European countries want to make that spectrum available for dynamic spectrum access, should they develop their own technical rules?
Basically, as I mentioned, the ECC decision is approved, and the EU implement. We talk about 6425 to 71. Okay, the regulation is finished basically. So, and as I mentioned, it's straightforward. It will be a license-exempt regulation, and it's difficult in Europe to speak about non-harmonized solutions, basically. If I take the example of Germany, I believe we are, should I say, unfavorable situation, but I believe there is no other country in Europe with more obligation for border coordination than Germany. I believe we have to coordinate along our borders with 11 countries. And therefore, our aim is, of course, to have harmonized solutions to ease that situation. And therefore, I assume that all the EU members will implement what is in the EU implementing decision. So that's the harmonized solution in Europe.
Thank you very much. Leonardo, there are a couple of questions for you here. There's a lot of interest in white spaces, in particularly the into the lower VHF bands. Toby Yule is curious to know what sort of applications you envisage in those frequencies, and would they need a sophisticated framework or something simple?
Thank you, Steve. Well, I guess I fully believe and I agree with Thomas when he states for an approach with more flexibility. So I think in this moment, we should be more concerned with principles than a mandatory or approach, like with a lot of rules and etc. But I guess in Brazil, it also depends about how can I put that, liquidity of spectrum. I mean, in the rural areas, this should not be a huge problem. So I reinforce the view of Steve when he, and I guess if I interpreted it right, he puts that there is no one size fits all. I mean, it depends of different variables, time, geographic, spectrum, and I guess in these areas in Brazil, especially taking into account the continental area of Brazil and how big it is. So I guess in the rural areas would be easier to have this approach. For instance, agribusiness responds for 25% of the Brazilian GDP. So with IoT perspectives, you can increase a lot of productivity in the farms. So you can use less inputs and you can make it more. You have gains of productivity. So I think for IoT, it could be a good answer. But let's not forget that there is other options also beyond TV spaces. And so I think we should not only focus in one strategy in terms of sharing spectrum.
Right, thank you. Martha, believe you want to make a comment?
Yes, thank you, Steve. That was on not on the last question for Leonardo, but on the last question for Thomas about the upper part of the band. I wanted to mention that as DSA, we have filed our comments for the consultations on pioneer bands and spectrum sharing frameworks that Thomas was presenting about the future discussion for spectrum policy, and that we were giving some thoughts and considerations about the possibility of using that upper part of the band for unlicensed access. And that will need studies, because the studies that were done initially were just for the lower part of the band. So we were basically requesting to consider the possibility of having studies for that upper part of the band in Europe. So just wanted to comment on that, because that is currently under discussion. So there is no decision at the European level of what they expect for the future of that segment of the band.
Thank you, Martha. Thomas, was that you wanting to respond, or? You're muted.
Okay, now it's better. Yeah, certainly. I believe you are aware that the reason why, let's say in Europe, the upper six, yeah, was not under consideration, I think are well known. Also, I think Mario in his presentation already indicated that the band is under consideration on an agenda item for WRC 23. And during that deliberations, I think it is necessary to have everything on the table. So you can always have different approaches. So, for example, if you know in the run-up to WRC 23, of course, the discussion will be on IMT. However, there will be the need to identify the sharing possibilities. There are people basically telling me, okay, if you compare the applications above 7.1.25 and below 7.1.25, then you will see there is quite a similarity. So what is the reason to believe that the results would be different? I don't believe in that, but we will see what the discussion will bring. And especially for that question you mentioned, when you look to my slide, I intentionally basically put on the slide the remark that inside CEPT, the work on Radiolan is basically finished. Because we do have this cooperation agreement with our standardization colleagues in ETSI, and the procedure is normally that ETSI drafts a so-called system reference document, and this will be then sent over to ECC, to Working Group Frequency Management. And up to now, I haven't seen a systems reference document concerning wireless LAN in the upper 6 gigs. On the other hand, I think it is necessary to have everything on the table. So if you would ask me now, will it be IMT or will it be radio LAN? My immediate response will be, I can't tell you at this stage. It might be the one or the other, but looking to other possibilities, and also where radio LAN is predominantly operated and IMT is predominantly operated, maybe we have a chance in the run-up to WRC 23 to find a cooperative solution, not indicating or having an idea how that could look like, but I think it's important that everything is on the table to find the right solution.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one or two more questions. For you, Leonardo, your discussion of the spectrum auction, which is very progressively not seeking to maximize revenues, has provoked some interest from the audience. And Yusuf Abdulkader would like to know how will you set the reserve price? What strategy or what formula or metrics will you use to set the reserve price in your auction?
All right, thank you. Well, first of all, the granting time is 20 years. So to get the reserve price, the net present value, we elaborate a hypothetical business plan where we estimate, of course, revenues, OPEX, CAPEX, and we bring it to a net present value by the WACC, the average weight average cost of capital, the regulatory WACC, of course. We use a greenfield approach. Of course, we do not. We know that some companies have a brown field, or they can have better initial conditions, especially the incumbents. But by law, we have to use in a greenfield approach, so we have the same price conditions for everyone that is interested in it. So we have also to take in account the ARPU, the Brazilian ARPU, to estimate revenues. Of course, depending on the premises, this value can vary. There are some variables that are very sensitive to in this process, like the WACC, for example. So After bringing everything in for net present value, we say what is the cost opportunity of using the band, I mean the economic value of it. So having that, I have to specify also the obligation, the investment commitments. And these investment commitments, they have a net present value negative because they're not, I mean, they're not stake, they're bond, to put like that. We privilege coverage, and we privilege those areas that do not have the right infrastructure or a good infrastructure in terms of transport and access. So that is pretty much how we do. Of course, I'm here doing a very simplification in general terms. We have been using this methodology for many years. Some of our employees of ANATEL have been in contact with ITU staff and some of the administrations to help them out and sharing our experience. And I think we have been doing, of course, this is a task that we have been improving a lot. This year, for example, we have done all the specification in Python. This, the other years in the past, we would use like tools like Excel, and we would wait long time to get the price to do the simulations. This year we used Python, and I think it was a good experience because we can simulate different scenarios. But as I mentioned, using a benchmarking, the cost of the spectrum PPP per hertz, it's below the average of what we have been seeing in other countries.
Thank you very much. I would love to read more about that methodology. That, I'm afraid, brings us to the end of our first session, and we're going to take a 10-minute break now before we get into the session on unlicensed spectrum. We'd just like to thank our keynote speakers for the excellent presentations and for the responding to the questions. And see you in 10 minutes time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Mark. Your video looks
Hey Josh,
good.
how are you doing?
Good.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yep. Audio sounds good.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Josh, just in terms of the presentation, I'm not really over familiar with GoTo. Do we use will the deck be loaded on your side, or do I present it from my side?
I will be projecting the slides, and you can just let me know when you want to advance.
Okay, 100%. Perfect. Audio is good?
Yes.
Okay, great stuff.
Hi, Chris.
Hello.
Just checking your video for the next session.
Yeah, I'm working on the webcams, trying to figure out what's going on here.
Hey, Steve, long time, and thanks for accepting the invitation.
Nice to see you.
Chris, your webcam looks good. John, your looks good. I think everyone's audio is working, so should be good. We'll have Steve introduce you one by one at the start of the next session.
Chris, is it Szymanski?
Yeah, indeed it is.
Excellent. Okay.
Looked like a good session. I caught kind of the tail end. Thought the questions were good and it was lively. Good job moderating it, Steve.
Thanks. Yeah, interesting. The upper 6 gigahertz is, I think, going to be a recurring theme in this conference.
I'm certain I'll focus on it. So,
just to note too, we're still broadcasting, so we will have you guys all go on mute now, and then we'll join up at 11:40 Eastern.
Gotcha.
Thank you, Ron.
Hello and welcome back to the next session of the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance Global Summit. This session is on the importance of unlicensed access to spectrum. And I think the description of the event asks the question, is there a need for more unlicensed access to spectrum for broadband? And I think that question is somewhat rhetorical. Or at least we will discover it so after we've heard our speakers. And we'll hear about research that has been commissioned by the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance. And with that, allow me to introduce our first speaker, and that's John Cioffi, Chairman and CEO of the Board of ASIA, the Adaptive Spectrum and Signal Alignment Incorporated. Welcome, John, and over to you. I'm afraid you're muted.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Thank you for unmuting me. Okay, well, thank you to DSA and Marta and the board for coming to me and my company, ASIA, about a year ago, asked us to provide some data that we might be in a unique position to provide on the use of spectrum and Wi-Fi in particular, both in North America and Europe. So that is the State of Wi-Fi report that we're summarizing here today in this talk. So if I could get the mouse control so that I can run the animation, again, DSA, Josh.
You should have control, John.
Let's see. It doesn't seem to be moving when I hit the hit either the mouse or the key. Yes, there we go. Okay. So today I'll give you a brief introduction to my company, ASIA, a little bit about the data aggregation that we've used to prepare this report, talk about some of the things that we will be reporting on, and then finally something called an overall spectrum needs score, which we created really as a metric to try to look at the need for licensing of new Wi-Fi spectrum. And then looked at some Wi-Fi broadband access trade-offs that might be important also in some of the decisions that are being made about spectrum globally. Okay, so let me tell you about ASIA, Adaptive Spectrum Signal Alignment. In particular, what do we do as a company? It's a data analytics and data optimization artificial intelligence platform that the company is built on. Basically, we collect a lot of data from access links around the world, whether that's mobile or home or fixed line type connections. That is processed by our systems. We try to look for issues and problems that might be resolvable either adaptively or through some kind of manual intervention as well. And so we provide these kinds of services typically to internet service providers really around the globe. And the idea is getting a better connectivity experience for the end user device of the internet connection. So largely concentrated in the access networks, including especially Wi-Fi, as important here. Now, typically how our customers value the products of ASIA is in terms of reduced operating expenses. So their call rates went down by a certain percentage, or dispatches were reduced, or churn was reduced, or maybe they saved on capital investments because they could better deploy or know where to deploy their capital based on their network needs of the end customers. And we focus really on the links to the home as shown here on the left of the slide. That could be fiber or copper or combination today, different types. And then increasingly so, the Wi-Fi connection inside the home is considered part of the fixed line access business. Often our customers will get complaint calls or issues that maybe the fixed line, but it may also be the Wi-Fi, and the customer perceives that Wi-Fi problem is part of the service, the internet service that's being provided, and so they have to take an action to try to correct that. So there are all kinds of issues about not being able to connect or connect in certain places and so forth in Wi-Fi. And so the idea of the report is to use our databases and collection to try to give an idea of what is the state of Wi-Fi in the different frequency bands, 2.5 and 5, and how is it evolving. And so we have products, of course, that we sell to the internet service providers. There are about 40 of them around the globe that we sell to, and we are responsible for day-to-day, actually almost minute-to-minute management of about 100 million connections around the globe. And so we use that for this study. Now, one of the things that's important here in doing a study of this type, and we spent time on it on the last year or so in consultation with the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance, is how do we get this data? How do we use? How do we protect it, and so forth? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that here, just to get started on how do we collect the data, how do we put it together. So we will have some kind of presence, typically in the Wi-Fi customer premises equipment. So you can think of that as the Wi-Fi router box, if you will. We may also have connections to other parts of the network, and we will collect data about the health of those connections on a regular basis, at least every 15 minutes, but sometimes more often than that. And we will do some kind of statistical analysis of it, and then provide some kind of results that we may use in other ways for our customers. In this case, what's happening is across a continent, we are actually collecting this data and then creating, if you will, histograms or probability distributions of different types of parameters that are collected. We do that across many internet service providers. We don't disclose the weightings of the different service providers, and we do this in a way that it's not possible to recover specific information about any individual customer or any individual internet service provider, either in North America or in Europe. We just aggregate that together to give it a holistic view for the continent of how broadband, and in particular Wi-Fi, is looking. So as I said, we do this for quite a few operators, and we're focusing here on North America and Europe in this particular study. And we found increasingly that internet service providers invest and are interested in Wi-Fi because their customers' perceived quality of experience can be impacted by Wi-Fi, and then they may fault the ISP for that. So it's all based on this data collection system. Now, what are some of the things that we're collecting and using in this report? The Wi-Fi traffic level, which is basically the sum of all the station's traffic daily and hourly, is reported to us from millions and millions of connections on both of those continents that we're looking at. Wi-Fi latency is the average round trip delay. This is kind of important here, between the Wi-Fi router and its client. Okay, so this is not a server to client delay metric. It's actually the access link and its contribution to that overall delay that you may see. For instance, other groups like OpenSignal may measure the entire delay. This is a component of it. Interference, which is basically the time percentage or the outage, if you will, because other routers, okay, unassociated stations, are occupying the same channel. And then there's congestion, which is the same router. Basically, it's the contention between the users that are served by that same router. So we bring in both of those are important data for assessing Wi-Fi performance. And then we also have a Wi-Fi throughput to transmit rate ratio. This is basically what you're getting in throughput relative to what the actual connection will report, sometimes called the modulation coding scheme data rate or parameter. We look at that ratio. 100% would never be attained on that, but would be the maximum that you could get to get an idea of what is the intensity of use, if you will, for the connection. So all 5 of these metrics have been collected in the report. And why did we choose these ones? Well, we can collect them obviously, but also because we find that they correlate well to the end customer's quality of experience for Wi-Fi. And so that translates into cost or profitability of the internet service provider. when it's not working well, of course, that costs them money. So we try to reduce the cost of problems. Again, on North America and Europe, we're collecting millions of lines in both places. And the period of collection was from May 28th last year to February 28th this year, so you can get an idea of the data. And what we do is we aggregate and analyze these measures that I just talked about on the previous slide. We do it for both the 2.4 and the 5 gigahertz bands. There's very little data available in the 6 gigahertz band, as you might surmise today. We'll hope to do that in the future. And we often do it for downlink and uplink as well as both of the frequency bands. We also collect on most of those connections the broadband data. So we actually know the fixed line performance as well, and whether or not the Wi-Fi or the fixed line is actually limiting on the connection is particularly important to a lot of internet service providers. Okay, so in our report for DSA, we have, taking advantage of the fact that we have these networks out there, we realize that regulators and application providers either care now today already or will be caring more and more so about the efficacy of Wi-Fi, its use, and how much more spectrum needs to be allocated. And we will find here shortly, you'll see that Wi-Fi already needs a 6 gigahertz spectrum in North America to avoid quality of experience limitations for video applications, particularly people working at the home, like many of us here on this call, remote healthcare, video entertainment, and also to justify any fiber to the home infrastructure investment. Obviously, if the fiber goes to the home and the consumer's not getting the bandwidth anyway, that the investment has a dubious return in that case. What you'll also see here is that Europe is falling about 6 to 12 months behind North America in terms of some of the use levels, congestion levels, and other metrics that we'll plot. So report objectives: track the Wi-Fi evolution, monitor and analyze the spectrum, and try to improve spectrum use. We'll see that the quality of experience is degrading from spectrum limitations. There was a pandemic bump, but you'll notice the period of time we took was after the pandemic was already in full progress at the end of May last year. So you're not going to see that in the beginning. So there's no bias really from that. This is during the pandemic and continuing forward, as opposed to something that was a large, significant event prior to that. There's a clear shift from the use of 2.4 to 5 gigahertz in North America, just beginning in Europe. And we hope to be tracking this quarterly or annually in the future as well. So, and this of course is going to relate to market trends on the use of 6 gigahertz band, and the report for this, the full report as well as these slides is at this link here at the DSA site. Okay, so let's look at Wi-Fi data use. It's rapid, and that means that the maintenance of good quality of experience for the end customer is going to be more and more challenging. So you can see here some percentages that basically show you the growth, okay? And you can see in North America, while it's still growing in the 2.4 gigahertz band, the growth in the 5 gigahertz band, as I said earlier, is much more rapid, both uplink and downlink. You can see that on congestion and interference, latency increasing, and then this throughput to transmit, which is kind of an efficiency metric. So lower is worse, and you can see it is getting lower. And you can see numbers in Europe a little bit different. Downlink and uplink, there's definitely growth in the 5 gigahertz band, but still growth in the lower band as well. And then, of course, growth in all of the other metrics as well. And more pronounced congestion in the 2.4 gigahertz band, as we expect that will shift to the 5 gigahertz band. So let's look at these a little bit more in detail. So here's the Wi-Fi traffic that we're seeing. This is the averaged daily traffic you see over the time period plotted for both of the frequency bands, the 2.4 and the 5, and you can see the percentage growth in North America. It's bigger in the 5 gigahertz band than it is in the 2.4. It's a little more equal in Europe, and the numbers are a little bit higher. In North America, you can see this 8 to 10 range here, where it's more 6 to 8 in Europe, but both of them are going up, as you can tell from the linear regression lines that are plotted through those data. So maybe not surprisingly, Wi-Fi traffic is indeed increasing for both continents. And in both of the frequency bands, but much more rapidly in the 5 gigahertz band in North America. Again, we get the Europe and United States up there. What we're seeing here is on the latency, and you can see that the 2.4 gigahertz band is a little bit less, a little bit more in the 5 gigahertz band in North America. Again, this is the latency from the Wi-Fi router to the device and back that's being provided here. And then in Europe, you can see more congestion in the 2.4 gigahertz band, if you will, so more latency occurring there, and the blue curve for 5 gigahertz coming up, but trailing a bit the effect we're already seeing in North America. But it is degrading over time as the traffic increases on both continents. If you were to look at it on an hourly basis and look at interference, remember interference is the collision of signals from other Wi-Fi routers and their served client devices. And maybe not surprisingly, over a 24-hour period, you have a cyclic effect. There are two things plotted. The green curve is the left vertical axis. The red curve is the right vertical axis. And what you see here is basically traffic and interference. And maybe not too surprisingly, it peaks in the evening, and when the traffic is higher, the interference is higher. And again, on the left, we have North America and Europe. You can see the numbers here in Europe, 22% of interference. Okay, so that means that the system is sensing a problem. It basically can't use the channel about a quarter of the time. In Europe, we see here on the right-hand side, sorry, this again is Europe on left and right-hand side, but the second plot is for a 9-month period instead of a 6-month period. And we did that because it actually shows that there's an increase in Europe that's fairly significant here. Adding the extra 3 months in here, you can see it's almost an extra 100 megabytes at peak periods during the day, and more significant interference. So definitely growth happening there in Europe in terms of interference. And then a congestion, which is the same axis point. So again, I'm trying to get my Europe and North America up there. Sorry, somehow the synchronization here on the animation came in the wrong sequence for the plots. But what you can see is North America here, congestion in the 5 gigahertz band rapidly increasing over that time period. Not as much yet in Europe, but you can see that it's getting to the level here on the right-hand side that we're seeing that was at the beginning of the North American period. So it would not be unreasonable to expect that type of rapid growth also in Europe will be coming, maybe following about 6 months behind the North American data. What you also see here is there's a 1% level in these curves that we have learned on the red line here. When our customers see this congestion level going above about 1%, that's when the customers start complaining. That's when it starts costing them money. And so it gives you kind of an idea. North America already there, Europe will get there. Busy hour Wi-Fi congestion. Again, here you can see the 1% line. And again, on the left-hand side for North America and the right-hand side for Europe, the 5 gigahertz is already crossing through that pain point. The 2.4 gigahertz in Europe is there already, and we expect that the 5 gigahertz will also get there based on the data we're collecting. So, and obviously the problem is more acute during busy hours. So users are reaching the limits of the 5 gigahertz spectrum very clearly in North America, and we expect that to happen in Europe as well. So Wi-Fi 6E may well be necessary already in North America and not far away from need in Europe. In order to try to simplify this as part of the report study that we did for DSA, we were asked to come up with kind of a single metric to make it a little easier, maybe for regulators or consumers or others to understand whether or not more spectrum is needed, whether there's a problem or an issue, rather than all these technical metrics that we've seen with latency and traffic volume, interference, congestion, so forth. And basically kind of a 0 to 1 type measure where 1 is awful, you need it now, and 0 is great, you don't need any more spectrum. And to try to maybe get some consensus around that as a single indicator to say more spectrum is necessary. So simply named spectrum needs score, and it predicts the spectrum needs. What we've done is we've combined all of these metrics we're collecting, the traffic levels, the interference levels, the latency, the congestion, the throughput to transmit ratio, and we put them all together into a single metric, and we try to put kind of a 5% worst case threshold on inclusion of these metrics, and then we weight them actually, and so far we're weighting them uniformly, and essentially adding or subtracting them depending on whether it's a positive or negative gradient relative to that particular parameter into a single metric. So the SNS that we use. And here's a score, and you can see again, North America on the left and Europe on the right in the 5 gigahertz band, and more rapid increase in North America, consistent with the data, but definitely increasing in Europe as well. And it gives you an idea at the table below the percentage increase on an annualized basis for both of the frequency bands. And again, you can see 5 gigahertz rapidly degrading in North America, and it's on its way to doing that in Europe as well. So, and of course, we're all working at home using Wi-Fi or using it for entertainment or many other productivity related uses. The pandemic has taught us all working at home may be very important. And with this score rising 25 to 40% annually, this is going to have an economic impact that regulators, governments, and others who are in authoritative positions are going to care about. So we try to make it simple here with a metric that may be helpful to all. Now, one of the questions that comes up often, especially for governments, is investment in infrastructure. How much and where should it go and how should it go? Often you'll hear things, well, we're just going to build fiber everywhere, right? But of course, you can't run a fiber to everyone's wristwatch. And so if we're looking at infrastructure investment and Wi-Fi is limiting, then any kind of capital expenditure on a higher speed pipe to the home is going to be limited in terms of its return on investment by the ability of the subtended devices or applications that are in use in the home to be able to take advantage of that bandwidth. So basically, this is a plot. It's actually the probability that the Wi-Fi speed is less than the broadband speed, which means the Wi-Fi would be limiting. So higher on this plot means worse. And then it's over time here, and you can see in the 2.4 gigahertz and the 5 gigahertz bands again, what's happening here. And you see in the 2.4 gigahertz band already more than half the time the Wi-Fi is limiting, and it's about 25% now and still growing rapidly on the 5 gigahertz band. So this is also an important metric as well. It may well be that the best infrastructure investment is in the Wi-Fi or wireless capabilities rather than simply building a high-speed pipe to some place that may be limited right after the end of that pipe. So, and higher on the chart means more difficulty or maybe less return on investment for infrastructure. And you can see here in North America, that rise there of 13% and 14% on the two curves. Important, meaning that investment in a higher speed alternative would not pay off basically for that. So it's already a big problem in the US and it's becoming more acute. So in conclusion, hopefully this report is helpful to everyone. 2.4 and 5 gigahertz bands are headed into saturation. The 5 gigahertz band is already growing faster in the North America, and then 2.4 still stressed in Europe, but shifting to 5 gigahertz use. Everything grows with the amount of traffic. You could see that on interference, on congestion, and so forth, and traffic's going up, as we could see. So wider Wi-Fi channels, such as we see for 80 megahertz, 160 megahertz, even 320 in the standards that are proposed, they also encourage more traffic when that happens. So that's going to lead to more congestion, more interference, a higher spectrum need score, and so encourages the continued allocation and better use of spectrum for all unlicensed applications with Wi-Fi. So and of course, as we all know, there are applications coming that may stress the bandwidths more, require lower latency, and so forth. So the idea here is to try to capture this and track it, and then get an idea of where the needs are and how acute they are for Wi-Fi. So with that, I'll conclude the formal part of the presentation here.
Thank you, John. That was remarkable. It's just a wealth of data, and I think often what doesn't get measured doesn't get prioritized in terms of management, and I think this is an invaluable resource. We have one question from the audience, and that is from Andrew Gowans, and he asked whether it is the different regulations between Europe and North America in terms of, say, power output that may account for some of the difference between results between North America and Europe, or what is your opinion?
I think one of the reasons is not so much power as far as we could tell, but more the DFS use is greater in Europe, and so there may be more restrictions on the 5 gigahertz band. Some of those are coming away as there are more areas or regions that are allowed for that, but that was one of the things we did catch in the data, that restriction was causing some limitation on the 5 gigahertz bands in Europe that really didn't happen in the US because those same restrictions weren't there. And I should say Canada as well, because this data for North America includes Canadian as well as US data.
Thank you. And one brief follow-up question also from Andrew is whether you think that Wi-Fi 6 will improve the situation in 2.4 and 5 gigahertz over time.
Well, I don't think this particular effect is super related to the actual modulation and so forth. The spatial streams that you're allowed to carve, use for the individual devices and schedule that more flexibly, let's say in especially the uplink on the Wi-Fi 6 may help. Okay, so it would simply, as it's coming in, it's more spectrum and it's also a little bit better use of space, but still the needs are there. And as the traffic continues to grow, even that will have its limits. Basically, it's limited by the number of antennas, and that depends on the number of users relative to the antennas as well, in terms of the Wi-Fi 6 features that are directed towards trying to carve the frequency spectrum a little bit better in everybody's home for the devices.
Right. Well, thank you very much. With that, I think we'll turn to. Oh, hang on. I'm not sure if we have time for one more. Nope, they're all just comments. So thank you again, John. And
thank you.
We turn to our next presenter, Mark Walker. He's the Associate Vice President for Sub-Saharan Africa for the International Data Corporation, IDC, and we'll be looking more at the economic impact of access technologies. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Steve. Great to be here, and thank you for DSA for making this opportunity available. Just by introduction, I'm with IDC, International Data Corporation, based out of Johannesburg in South Africa. So a lot of the data I'm going to be sharing is going to be very different to what John shared. John gave a very good view of what is happening in Europe and North America. Obviously, there's a lot of leadership coming from there, and Africa follows a lot of that. But there's also a lot of unique adoption rates and so on that I'll be talking through during my presentation. So, you know, the key thing for us is access is the foundation for progress. So moving to the next slide then. You know, the big gap, you know, internet penetration rate by country, the big gap is always Africa. To the next slide, please. Now, the issue here is, as much as North America, Western Europe, or Europe as a whole, and let's say the developed world is undergoing a massive change in the total digital paradigm. Industries are undergoing massive transformation. A digital economy has developed, and it's been accelerated significantly through the pandemic that's, you know, washed across the world over the last 12 months. You know, it's affecting everything from basically tourism through to education, through to the way governments operate, through to supply chains and so on. And, you know, post-COVID, when it eventually happens, we will be looking at a very frictionless economy, totally integrated into a digital platform. The future of work is changing. Continuous supply chains and operations are a reality and will continue to expand. And there'll be a lot of innovation of new ecosystems, especially in digital ecosystem models, to do with how, from a government perspective, how our citizens interact with government, our government interacts with government, how our citizen services are delivered, and how, from a commercial point of view, the wealth of data that is captured is going to be monetized. A lot of change. This is a reality already, and it's going to be moving very, very quickly. And not only in North America and Western Europe and the developed world, but very much in Africa, very much in Latin America and the Far East as well. So moving to the next slide, please. Now, the key here is that access boosts economic activity. ITU data, and I'm sure a lot of the audience is already familiar with, so I'm not going to dwell on this very long. But internet access is growing significantly. It's in Africa, it's growing far quicker than as soon as connectivity is allowed. You see massive uptake. I remember 10 years ago, where the east coast of Africa was without undersea cable. Once the cable landed, we saw areas of East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania lighting up very, very quickly and using up a lot of the bandwidth on those undersea cables. And as the terrestrial networks expanded, so you saw the activity increasing. And digital economy is starting to pick up in these areas. There's still a lot of challenge in terms of rural access, and that is being solved as we speak. But at the end of the day, we're looking at about a 2.5% increase in gross domestic product, purely on the fact that access is available, commerce can work, and governments can actually regulate in order to drive this kind of adoption of a fully digital ecosystem. Next slide, please. And obviously in Africa, we've got an average, a mean age in Africa of around 18 years old. One of the youngest in the world. I think the second youngest is Afghanistan. But what we're seeing is massive unemployment as a key issue, and a huge base of people that are ready for employment as long as the skills are available and they can participate in the wilder economy. And what we can see now is from a professional developer perspective, in the software environment, you're starting to see a lot more pickup of professional developers across the African continent. And you can see from the map on the right-hand side, where the bigger developed populations are, is where the most internet access is. That's an obvious statement, but we see as the networks expand, and continue across the African geography. Much more developers coming to the fore, and much more use of digital technology to drive usage of these things. Also, development of entertainment, development of digital-based services, especially in the government domain, has become a very, very key area. Next slide, please. Now, I'm just going to talk through 3 examples very, very quickly. And basically, we're looking at healthcare. Some examples here from a government perspective. In Africa, a lot of the healthcare situation is managed by government or controlled by government very, very strongly. And you can see a lot of remote experiences happening from a healthcare access point of view. But from remote and telehealth in the more rural areas through to data-driven healthcare and life sciences, and in the urban areas, things like intelligent automation, where you're having AI-enabled customer interactions and diagnosis and so on. This is still a way out in Africa, except in the more developed urban areas. But certainly we're seeing these tech, there's a lot of investment going into these areas. And I'll be dwelling on them a little bit further in a moment. Next slide, please. This will be talking about education, from the education sector. And here we're looking at some of the survey data that IDC has produced recently. And we do a survey of chief information officers across the African geography, Middle East and Turkey, twice per annum. And there's some interesting views on where the money is being spent. And we look at the education sector, both government and private. We see a lot of the CIOs that they've accelerated or brought forward their digital initiatives roadmaps by at least 1 year. And this is in the education space. Obviously, in Africa, there's a big demand for education, given the young population. And COVID has accelerated the use of internet-based technology to deliver blended learning and learning-based platforms. And we expect that to be growing significantly going over the next year or two. And again, and even so into the future. Can we look at the next slide, please? Now, obviously, John also mentioned, the economic imperatives from an accessibility point of view. And access to banking and financial services is an imperative for economic growth and wealth creation overall. On top of that, of course, is the development of the economies in the African geography. And this will apply to as much as Africa, it will apply globally as well in less developed regions. What we're seeing is as payment platforms especially are brought to the fore, you see the obvious example is the M-Pesa brought out by Safaricom in Kenya. There's other payment platforms that have also come to the fore, and the enablement of digital commerce to occur, where goods and services are traded on a digital platform on a normal basis. This brings a lot more people into the economic environment, into the economic ecosystem, if you like, and enables faster growth overall in the economy. And we're seeing a lot of this kind of growth, especially in the Middle East, Turkey, and Africa region, that the initiatives are rolling out far quicker. And there's a lot of innovation happening in this space, where products are brought to market to enable access for lower earning income and lower income bands, be able to actually drive economic participation, if you like. And this is, again, a key area where access is an absolute non-negotiable to enable the reach into these areas. Next slide, please. And the next slide as well. So basically, the new world it needs specific technology. And through the survey, and this is specific again in sub-Saharan Africa now, where we're looking at the countries basically below the North African region. And what we're seeing, speaking to these CIOs, that the majority, or many of them, 46%, have accelerated their digital initiatives roadmaps. At the sample base here is large organizations in the African region with more than 100 employees. All of them, or a lot of them, have accelerated the digital roadmaps by at least a year, and about 30% by more than 2 years. What does this mean? It means that they've brought forward investment to absolutely enable connectivity, enable access, and roll out infrastructure to get more and more people onto the grid, if you like, or onto the digital ecosystem. These experiences are key. There's a lot of business model reinvention here that's occurring as well. Born in the cloud type environments are starting to come to the fore, and we're seeing a lot of those continuing to happen as we go forward. The digital first, about 75% of enterprises that we spoke to are investing heavily in business process transformation this year across the African continent, and that they're driving customer engagement, things like employee productivity. They're managing that, business resilience, and also reshaping their workforces to work from home or work remotely, work anywhere. Again, access is key to all of these. Next slide, please. It's always interesting to just figure out, that's all very well. We're rolling out, there's a demand for technology, there's investment going in technology, but what technologies are specifically of interest? And again, now we're looking here specifically on narrowing it down a little and just looking at South Africa, which is a fairly developed region from a digital environment point of view. Increased use of robotic process automation and AI, so looking for automation excellence in the commercial environment, looking to transform the infrastructure by doing a lot more hosting, co-location, cloud infrastructure, and so on. And a big issue is security and resilience excellence. Obviously, cloud is a big area, and then how to use data in terms of managing the volumes of data that are coming in and continuing to be used. So technology-wise, we're looking at data management technologies, specific cloud platforms, data center type rollouts, cloud skills and processes and tools, and a lot of discussion around the whole security and how securing this is this environment, especially from a cloud point of view. Next slide, please. Now, narrowing it down further and looking at specific what technologies specifically are chief information officers across the African and Middle Eastern region looking at in 2021. And we're interesting to see the Internet of Things technologies, remote sensing, instrumentation of processes, instrumentation of environments, very much top of line. 67% of the respondents are talking around artificial intelligence and machine learning. Software-defined infrastructures are coming to the fore, robotic process automation and edge computing. And you'll notice that these are the type of things that you don't expect in Africa, right? Or the Middle East Africa region, in fact. A lot of the perception is that the basic connectivity is good enough. It's not good enough, especially from a commercial environment. Keeping in mind that the survey that we do is looking at companies of 100 employees and more. So not larger organizations in the traditional sense from a Western perspective. Could I have the next slide, please? Looking at the primary mode of access in markets is also changing. What I've done here is I've looked at the latest International Data Corporation mobile phone trackers, and we're looking at the global picture overall, and then just isolating the emerging market picture, where we're looking at Latin America and Middle East Africa as an example. And what we're seeing, feature phones obviously declining in use over time, but smartphones globally are kind of flattening out in terms of their install base and their year-on-year shipments. Whereas in the emerging markets, these are still showing significant growth rates year-on-year and are expecting to grow fast into the future. The issue here is that mobile phone is the primary access mode. And John mentioned, you can't do fiber to your wristwatch. And this is a very, very important point to note. This is where rural access, rolling out of Wi-Fi and affordable and reliable technology on a Wi-Fi basis is becoming very, very key in these kind of environments. So areas like Latin America, like parts of the Asia Pacific environment, and especially in Africa, technologies that can work on Wi-Fi are going to be encouraging access across the board. Could I have the next slide, please? And this is obviously underpinned by the type of IT infrastructure spend. It's growing at about 3.5% compound average growth rate. It'll reach about 12.3 billion by 2024. And these are big numbers. And the type of investment is going to public cloud, it's going to hybrid cloud, on-premise infrastructures, and network at the edge and network as a service. And you can see where the growth drivers are, and this is really important. We're seeing a lot of it is going into Internet of Things and edge computing, software-defined infrastructure. These areas are very, very critical, especially in the African context or the emerging market context. Let's move to the next slide. I think this is a really important view looking forward now. And I just want to spend a minute or two on this slide. At the moment, and I think John's presentation illustrated the sensitivity to latency and the data processing requirements. And from IDC's perspective, we look at these very, very interestingly. And there's a lot of talk globally around 5G deployment and where it's going. We know that IoT and edge are growth technologies. And we know that a lot of technologies, medium to large organizations, are deploying Internet of Things technology or are planning to adopt in the next 12 months. That is an African statistic. We're also looking at about 2 billion Wi-Fi 6 device shipments to be expected, the shipment in this year, of which about 338 million will be expected to be Wi-Fi 6E enabled. And about 26% of medium to large organizations in the Middle East, Turkey and Africa region are expected to adopt edge computing in the next 12 to 18 months. What does this tell us? It tells us very, very clearly that there's a demand for technology that can be easily deployed, that is reliable, accessible, secure, trustworthy, and that is and especially on the cost aspect is very, very key on this. Looking at the shipment chart on the top right-hand side, you can see there that we're looking at a significant. This is a global view. But we can see that Wi-Fi 6 is becoming a key area. And IDC believes very strongly that the evolution of these technologies includes a blended Wi-Fi and 5G view to unlock the potential of these edge cloud and IoT applications going forward. As I say, I think we're starting to see from a Wi-Fi point of view a worthwhile alternative to 5G type thinking. Or in fact, a starting point where cost and these kind of issues are key. Could I have the next slide, please? And I think looking forward then, looking at the technologies that are being rolled out, not only from an IoT and the more complex technologies, but from a Wi-Fi perspective as well. Some of the key quality of experience issues that we're seeing filtering up in every survey we do is access, and the accessibility is it ease of use? Is it easy to use? Is it teachable? Is it scalable? There's an issue around resiliency. Does it fit, or is it line of business fit for purpose? Or even on the consumer side, is it easy to configure? Is it resilient? Is it reliable? And has it got a good utility value? Trustworthiness is about security. All these communications technologies need a very high level of security. And with the threat platform is far wider than it's ever been, with a lot of remote connectivity coming to the fore now. And finally, the big one, especially in emerging markets, is affordability. And here we're looking more from a corporate point of view. Is there good value for money? Is there the total cost of ownership worthwhile? And what is the return on investment? And these are issues that have to be considered very, very clearly as we drive access across this region in any emerging market, in fact. If I have to rate these, I think the affordability is very much the number one issue. The second one is accessibility, resilience, and then trustworthiness. So with that, I'm moving towards the end of my presentation. So thank you for your attention. If you can move to the next slide. And we're happy. Thanks for your time. Hopefully you have some interesting insights for you. Back to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that big picture view. As the economist Paul Romer said, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, and it's great to see how governments and corporations are responding to the challenge to make access more available. Without further ado, we'll turn to our final speaker in this session, and that's Chris Szymanski, Director of Product Marketing at Broadcom, and we're going to hear a bit about Wi-Fi 6. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate the opportunity to speak today. If we could go on to the next slide. So John's presentation really teed us up on the growth of Wi-Fi and how, additional access is stressing our networks over time. He highlighted the value of 6 gigahertz in easing congestion and providing higher quality of service. Mark teed us up by explaining the importance of technology transformation to our digital economy, providing access to improved healthcare, education, and financial services, which will boost the overall economy, and he explained the importance of Wi-Fi in enabling these use cases. My talk's going to focus on the importance of the full 6 gigahertz band, global 6 gigahertz developments, and Wi-Fi 6E market readiness. Next slide, please. So Wi-Fi is really the way most people access the internet, and that's what we've seen in the decisions that a lot of the administrations have written when they've designated the band for unlicensed use or license-exempt use. As broadband speeds increase through the investment in backhaul that is necessary for 5G, for 6G, at all times, anything wireless goes into the ground. As these backhaul speeds and broadband speeds increase, Wi-Fi speeds also need to increase. And the 6 gigahertz band provides up to 7 pristine 160 megahertz channels. We also learned that people that do not have access to good broadband are increasingly left behind in today's digital economy. Through community networks and last mile connectivity, Wi-Fi closes the digital divide. Wi-Fi also complements 5G networks, enabling 5G services indoors and in areas where 5G cellular is not economical. And let's face it, the competition among multiple radio access technologies reduces costs. Next slide, please. So why the full 6 gigahertz band? We're hearing a lot about, maybe we should start with just the bottom 500 megahertz. Other administrations are saying, let's move forward with the full 6 gigahertz band. Let me give you a device maker's perspective. Equipment on the market is already designed to operate over the entire band, which basically means that reducing the functionality is going to increase costs for markets that have only implemented the bottom part of the band. Enterprise and dense urban environments require more channels to work effectively. Dense urban networks can require up to 14 non-overlapping channels. So the graph that John provided to you showing how congestion increases when you have dense communities or dense enterprise networks, you need more channel reuse. If you have all of the 6 gigahertz band, you're going to be able, in most circumstances, to run 160 megahertz channel. Really dense networks, 80 megahertz. The bottom part of the band would leave you with, at best, likely 40 megahertz channels. Wi-Fi 7 is the very first technology that was specifically designed to incorporate the 6 gigahertz band. Not only channel bandwidth, but there's something called link aggregation. And this link aggregation is going to be the most cost-effective and efficient for economies that open up the entire band, because less filtering will be required when you're linking the 5 gigahertz band and the 6 gigahertz band. And last but not least, alternatives are speculative. Very extensive studies have been done by industry and by administration showing that unlicensed devices can coexist. Satellite and microwave services can thrive. Is this the case truly when you're talking about IMT in the band? There's also lots of equipment that's available for Wi-Fi 6E, soon to be Wi-Fi 7. I see no product to IMT and it's really going to take quite a long time. There's nothing happening in standardization for IMT as well. Next slide. So if we look at the evolution of Wi-Fi on the time frame, and if we were to look at when unlicensed spectrum was first designated, and this is an FCC perspective, you can see here that unlicensed bands were first designated in 1985, and there was, a lot is considered a sandbox, a lot of innovation, but you didn't see a lot of really, commercially adopted, standardized unlicensed. You saw, garage door openers, baby monitors, and a variety of different unlicensed technology. But Wi-Fi really took off in 1999 when Steve Jobs decided to incorporate it in the Mac. And you see here that over a period of time, from Wi-Fi 3 all the way to Wi-Fi 6, there was no new spectrum designated. So there was a question previously on whether or not Wi-Fi 6 would continue to evolve and if this would ease congestion. I would contend that Wi-Fi is constantly evolving and becoming more efficient, but there was a period of about 17 years where industry kept evolving with no new designations. And really, 6 gigahertz was the breath of fresh air needed, and we're going to see tons of innovation using this new spectrum moving forward. Next slide, please. And so this is a map that Broadcom's been tracking, and we see that over 54% of the world's GDP has already designated at least a portion of the 6 gigahertz band. And there's really powerful momentum for the full band. And so, a device maker's dream is scale. Scale allows us to provide the most efficient technology at a very cost-effective price. And so our dream is to see the whole globe lit up red. And we're well on the way, given that the FCC kicked this off just last year. The European Union just recently issued its mandate, and we're seeing other countries light up all over the globe. Next slide, please. So just a few fast facts on 6 gigahertz band Wi-Fi. So number one, over 31% of the world's economy has already designated all 1200 megahertz of spectrum for unlicensed use, creating an enormous market. Studies have been developed showing that if the whole 6 gigahertz band were available, $512 billion in incremental global economic benefit by 2025. So given the time horizon that was shown in the IDC presentation by Mark, it takes time for technologies to be adopted and flourish. And so this is just a staggering number. Broadcom believes that this is going to unlock unlicensed innovation for the next 25 years. We're designing our technologies for digitally immersive experiences. And these are some of the KPIs that we're seeing in terms of speed, latency, performance, and use cases related to telemedicine and education that are really foundational for the society that we're living in today. Next slide, please. So Broadcom was so excited about this opportunity that we began investing really years before any government around the world had designated the band for license exempt use. And we enabled a full slate of chipsets for Wi-Fi 6E devices. Smartphones, access points on the consumer side and the enterprise side. And, we announced these early in 2019. So a full year before the FCC made its decision. Next slide. And this is really what we're seeing. Just some of the headlines. Wi-Fi 6E is really proliferating, and the industry has really moved to take advantage of the momentum that we're seeing by administrations being generated all over the globe. Wi-Fi Alliance is projecting over 338 million Wi-Fi 6E devices. As Mark said, this is an IDC projection. If you look at the Wi-Fi Alliance website, you'll see that 33 Wi-Fi 6E certified devices have already been certified, and the certification was only released very beginning of this year. Netgear, TP-Link, and ASUS access points are available in the market. Samsung Galaxy S21 Ultra released a smartphone really quickly after the FCC published its homologation rules. What's really staggering here is how this is upending. Wi-Fi 6E is really changing the way certain products go to market. Typically, televisions and those types of products will adopt technologies 2, 3, 4, 5 years after smartphones and consumer access points and high-end laptops. But Samsung and LGE announced very, very quickly that their 8K QLED TVs, their high-end TVs, were going to incorporate Wi-Fi 6E, which is really, really interesting, and it shows the value proposition for digitally immersive experiences. Who's going to spend the money on 8K TV and streaming if it's glitchy? And you know, Wi-Fi 6E provides the medium to provide a glitch-free user experience. Next slide, please. So, oh, sorry, we're going to go into the demos before we go into the summary. So, Josh, if you could do this for me. What we've done is we've compiled 4 different demos with ASUS, Netgear, TP-Link, and Samsung, who have all incorporated Broadcom's chipsets and in their own words describe the value proposition for Wi-Fi 6E and 6 gigahertz, really showing that we are ready to go in administrations and regulatory regimes where 6 gigahertz is available. Products are ready for the consumers. Josh, if you could proceed, please.
Wi-Fi just got its biggest upgrade yet with Wi-Fi 6E. Now that we're working, learning, and gaming at home more than ever before, our Wi-Fi can become congested and slow. We need Wi-Fi that can meet all our demands and more. That's where Wi-Fi 6E comes in. Wi-Fi 6E expands your Wi-Fi with a new, expansive, and interference-free band. With this new Wi-Fi expansion, you get more than 2 times the Wi-Fi that your current Wi-Fi provides, so you have a lot more room for a lot more devices. Plus, this new band is built to support only the latest and future Wi-Fi devices. Now you can unlock faster speeds and lower latency for all the high bandwidth applications of today and tomorrow, including 4K and 8K streaming, AR and VR gaming, video conferencing, and much more. The biggest leap forward for Wi-Fi in years. Wi-Fi 6E from Netgear.
Our home networks are changing every day, and Wi-Fi technology is constantly evolving to match the needs of tomorrow. In 2019, Wi-Fi 6 introduced OFDMA, which advanced the efficiency of sending data to devices. Performance skyrocketed, leading to an explosion of new Wi-Fi products with speeds and capabilities never seen before. However, with billions of legacy devices still connecting to the traditional 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz bands, networks are witnessing unavoidable congestions and slowdown. The solution? Wi-Fi 6E. This expansion of the Wi-Fi 6 standard opens up a brand new Wi-Fi band. Wi-Fi 6E's newly opened 6 gigahertz band ensures congestion-free networks, drastically improving the reliability of continuous high-speed connection. This new spectrum spans a total of 1200 megahertz, doubling the width of current Wi-Fi broadband, while supporting 7 160 megahertz channels all at the same time. Whether you're watching 8K videos, streaming the latest games, or exploring AR/VR worlds, Wi-Fi 6E will enable you to do all of these and more. Join us as TP-Link's Wi-Fi 6E solutions deliver a faster, more responsive, and more robust network, pushing the envelope of what Wi-Fi technology can achieve.
환경에서 와이파이 6의 성능 차이를 확인해 보겠습니다. 왼쪽은 기존 5GHz 대역에서 동작하는 단말, 오른쪽은 와이파이 6E를 지원하여 6GHz 대역에서 동작하는 단말입니다. 와이파이 아이콘 우상단에 6E 아이콘을 통해 이를 확인하실 수 있습니다. 그럼 다운로드를 시작해 보겠습니다. 와이파이 6E가 더 많은 주파수 대역을 사용할 수 있고 최신 표준을 지원하는 기기들만 6GHz 대역을 사용하기 때문에 효율성이 개선되어 훨씬 빨라진 속도를 체감하실 수 있습니다.
Thank you. So as you can see from Asus, Netgear, TP-Link, and Samsung, huge value proposition in the 6 gigahertz band and enabling immersive real-time services. Samsung demonstrated with its latest product, the Samsung Galaxy S21, that Wi-Fi 6E operations provide strong, real consumer benefits. We see that there's unmistakable regulatory momentum for 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi, and so our question is, why wait? The equipment is ready. Wi-Fi 7 works most effectively over the entire 6 gigahertz band, and we see this coming relatively quickly, and other options are speculative at best. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's a very exciting point to end the session on in the tremendous potential that that 6 gigahertz represents. I'll start with a question, if I may, and that is about outdoor broadband. I think one of the most interesting areas for me, having seen an explosion of innovation with Wi-Fi, is it being repurposed for as a backhaul technology. And we've seen companies like Ubiquiti and Cambium, Mimosa, and others, grow from zero to huge, developing this technology that is now beginning to supplant a lot of license band backhaul technologies in some cases. But in terms of the regulation of 6 gigahertz, it's going to work a little differently than 5 gigahertz in the requirement for an automated frequency controller, geolocation database. Could you comment a little bit on how you see that part of the 6 gigahertz market evolving?
Sure, thank you for the question, Steve. So agree that advancements in backhaul technology is very exciting, and as the wireless internet service providers, or WISPs, have shown, Wi-Fi is a very effective technology for delivering last mile or last few kilometers access, community access. One of the key principles behind license-exempt use is do no harm. Can administrations make more intensive use of the band? Can satellite uplink grow and flourish? Can existing services over microwave backhaul or electronic news gathering service continue to grow and flourish? And so the key here to your question is, what's currently in play in these countries? If countries have a large amount of wireless microwave backhaul, then in order for these WISP operations to occur, you're going to have some form of coordination. The industry is recommending an automated frequency coordination to reduce costs and allow scale. And that's going to be incredibly effective in places where there's a lot of microwave links. Like in the United States, there's over 100,000 fixed links in the 6 gigahertz band. Other countries might have less density of use, and so there could be some light frequency coordination, light licensing. But the key here is in order existing licensed incumbents to be protected and flourish, there'll need to be some sort of coordination. In administrations where there isn't any fixed microwave, then you wouldn't really have that requirement, and there'd be no need for coordination at all, and you could enable outdoor use. In terms of protecting the FSS, administrations have carefully crafted the rules to sort of limit the number of networks outdoors, or to attenuate the signal so that at a certain degree above the horizon, the satellite receiver is not going to see the energy from these unlicensed devices. So these are important considerations, but absolutely, administrations can continue to use current services and use this important technology for backhaul.
Thanks very much. If I can ask John and Mark, if you're still there, please to turn your webcams back on.
Yes. Hello? Yeah, all right, I'm here.
Right. Any reactions from to what you've heard from your peers today?
Well, it's a positive to see the industry responding to the need in different ways, whether that's in Africa or in North America, Europe, and vendors trying to respond to that. What would be good in an overall sense in terms of monitoring or tracking, I continue to encourage the standardization in a real sense of collection mechanisms and so forth for data. One of the difficulties in tracking all of this and so forth is, while there are many standards organizations today, there are many vested interests as well. And so the interfaces and the ability to collect is still murky. I know because our company deals with this on a daily basis. So would love to, I don't think the solutions are in place for that yet. And I think that will eventually prevent this from going as far as it can. If we don't, I believe there are ways to solve that, but they need to be addressed, and it'll benefit everybody in doing so. But happy to see the enthusiasm and the advances as well.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see the differences between, you know, what the developed world has, where Africa is. There's significant areas of change there. But at the same time, you know, there's I'm just thinking of the spectrum, just the freeing up of spectrum, and looking at, you know, to John's point, a lot of entrenched interests and a lot of different players. And I think from a, you know, we're seeing in South Africa, for instance, the spectrum allocation has been an issue for years, and it continues to be an issue. And I think that is something that governments need to really pay attention to, and quickly. This is a major roadblock going forward.
I have a question from the audience from Azar Zarabini. I might almost describe it as a hot potato question, which is, what is your advice for administrations that plan to delay the development of unlicensed 6 gigahertz frameworks until the WRC conference in 2023 makes a decision on IMT 6 gigahertz? Anyone like to tackle that one?
Yeah, I would appreciate the opportunity to tackle that hot potato. So I understand the rationale, and it's very important to let processes that are in flight progress. It's important to understand that the ITU's IMT study is for Region 1. And so I would understand that Region 1 administrations would want to see this and understand whether or not there's an opportunity. At the same time, you know, we've done extensive studies of our lands coexisting with incumbents, and we understand what the constraints are on power. On the CEPT study, it was found that you needed to limit the power to 200 milliwatt. And it's hard to see how 200 milliwatt in indoor operations is going to enable IMT. Broadcom makes products for 5G. We love 5G. But at the end of the day, the market dynamics and the constraints have to equal. And so at the very least, we're encouraging administrations, if you've already made up your mind, why wait? It makes sense that you'd be studying simultaneously RLAN. We've kicked off a study in CEPT at the bottom part of the band. It doesn't really make sense to wait for the entire IMT study and then commence a 1 or a 2 year study cycle on the upper part of the band. By that time, Wi-Fi 8 is going to kick around and administrations are going to lose some of the edge and some of the benefit that Wi-Fi 7 will provide. So we would encourage administrations to take a sober look. We understand these are very, very difficult decisions, but would appreciate the opportunity to continue studies. And, you know, while this process plays out, at the very least, we can be studying RLAN coexistence. And when, you know, administration determines the equities for their citizens and whether or not they would benefit from more immersive use without displacing incumbents or potentially providing additional constraints on incumbent operations, everything will be fully studied and they can make up their mind. So, you know, that's a long-winded answer to let's study. If we can move forward, we'd love to see it. If we need to wait, at least we'll be prepared.
I might add that the report that was presented earlier, governments and regulators could encourage participation in things like that. So Chris refers to studies, but getting more and more accurate data requires the collaboration of as many service providers in of course, a guarded and protected way for their data so that the accuracy of understanding is better and better with time. And that's something they can do immediately. You know, go to the service providers in your country and say, you know, are you participating in these data collections? And that will help us, you know, to get a more refined measurement of just exactly what the need is, and that will help not only the current spectrum decision on the other half of the 6 gigahertz band, but other decisions in the future as well. No matter where the spectrum may be, getting, you know, beyond a few boxes scattered throughout a country measuring internet performance to state-of-the-art, ubiquitous everywhere, consistent, accurate, trustworthy measurement is a goal that can be achieved in a few years, but it require the administration's regulatory authorities to maybe get behind the process of just normalizing the measurement and how we do it.
The call for more data for better informed decision making is a great way to I think draw us to a close. I'd like to turn the final word over to Martha Suarez, and as we draw to the end of this first session of the Global Summit.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve. I'm very excited to see how this session ended. We had great information and insights from very serious speakers that have been working on processing data and information for a while. And we also had a great presentation from industry on how 6 gigahertz unlicensed ecosystem is ready. So I hope those that participated in this first session today finish the session with new information, with some learnings. I think it's hard in this online group of events, but I hope that they found some new insights and some new data and references. So I would like to thank our participants. We had, I think at some point we had almost 190 participants online, which we think is a great number, especially taking into account diversity of participants from different regions of the world. So thank you, and please continue watching the different sessions. We will have session 2 at 10 p.m. Eastern time tonight, or exactly our 9 in the morning Jakarta time tomorrow. So hope to keep engaged with all of you, and thank you very much to all the speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Marta.
Thank you.